Michael Smith adjusted his tie nervously as he stepped into the first-class cabin of the aircraft. It wasn't his first time flying in luxury, but today was different. He was a black man flying alone in a predominantly white space, a subtle weight of expectations pressing down on him. The flight attendant greeting him, Katie Rose, had a smile painted on her face, but something in her eyes betrayed her discomfort. Her gaze lingered just a second too long on him, her blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she scanned him from head to toe. Michael ignored it. Years of practice had taught him to brush off the microaggressions that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Welcome aboard," Katie said, her voice bright but clipped. She handed him his glass of pre-flight champagne, her fingers brushing his only briefly before she recoiled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for him to notice. He sighed inwardly, taking his seat by the window, hoping the tension wouldn't escalate. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Michael couldn't help but notice how Katie hovered around the other passengers with a warmth that felt genuine. She laughed with the older white couple seated across from him, chatting about their vacation plans. She helped a young woman adjust her overhead luggage, going so far as to pat her shoulder in reassurance. But when she approached Michael to confirm his meal choice, her demeanor stiffened, her tone professional to the point of being icy. "Beef or chicken?" she asked, not meeting his eyes. "Chicken, thank you," Michael replied evenly. Katie nodded curtly and moved on. He shook his head, reminding himself that it didn't matter. He had every right to be here, just like anyone else. Still, the subtle slights gnawed at him. An hour into the flight, Michael's unease deepened. Katie seemed to be going out of her way to avoid him. She refilled everyone else's drinks without hesitation but skipped his row until he had to call her over. Even then, her response was begrudging. "I'll get to you in a moment," she said sharply, walking away without acknowledging his request. Michael glanced around. A middle-aged man seated 2 rows behind him raised his eyebrows sympathetically, as if to say, "I see it too." When Katie finally returned, she handed him his drink with an exaggerated carelessness, spilling a few drops on his tray table. "Seriously?" Michael said, his voice low but firm. He grabbed a napkin to clean up the mess. "Oh, I'm sorry," Katie said, her words dripping with insincerity. "Let me fix that for you." She dabbed at the spill half-heartedly, her expression hardening when Michael didn't smile or thank her. "Forget it," he said, brushing her off. Katie stood there for a moment, her lips pursed, before storming off. The older white woman across the aisle gave Michael a pitying glance, but said nothing. Things took a darker turn when dinner was served. As Katie handed Michael his tray, she let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Here you go, sir," she said, her tone teetering on the edge of mockery. Michael narrowed his eyes. "Is there a problem?" "No problem at all," Katie replied, flashing a tight, artificial smile. But the way she lingered, standing just a little too close, felt like a challenge. Michael wasn't sure what she was trying to provoke, but he refused to give her the satisfaction. "Thanks," he said curtly, turning his attention to his meal. She walked away, but he could feel the stares of other passengers burning into him. A man seated nearby whispered something to his wife, who glanced at Michael with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The rest of the flight was a series of small humiliations. Katie ignored his call button multiple times, only to respond immediately when other passengers signaled for assistance. She bumped his elbow with the drink cart twice, apologizing loudly but without an ounce of sincerity. Each incident seemed calculated, as if she wanted to remind him that, in her eyes, he didn't belong. Michael tried to stay calm, but the final straw came when he overheard Katie talking to another flight attendant near the galley. "I don't know how someone like him can afford first class," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Probably some rapper or athlete?" The other flight attendant chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to call her out. Michael clenched his fists, his mind racing. Should he confront her? Complain to the airline? He had no illusions about how such a confrontation would be perceived. A black man raising his voice on an airplane, even in defense of himself, could easily spiral into a situation he couldn't control. As the flight approached its destination, Katie delivered one last insult. When collecting trash, she skipped Michael's row entirely, forcing him to hold onto his empty tray and drink cup until another flight attendant came by. "Are you okay, sir?" the other attendant asked, her expression genuinely concerned. Michael nodded, forcing a tight smile. "I'm fine, thanks." But he wasn't fine. As the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, Michael couldn't shake the heavy weight in his chest. The humiliation, the quiet indignities he'd endured for hours, had taken their toll. As he stepped off the plane, he resolved not to let this slide. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, whether he'd file a complaint, share his story publicly, or simply let it go, but one thing was clear: Katie Rose had underestimated him. Michael had barely settled into his seat when Katie Rose returned, her presence announced by the sharp clack of her heels against the cabin floor. She held a tray with a single glass of champagne, the bubbles glinting in the soft cabin light. Her smile was forced, stretched too tight to be genuine, and her gaze flickered over Michael with a look that made his stomach tighten. "Here's your champagne," she said, her voice laced with exaggerated politeness. She leaned in slightly, just enough for her next words to feel like a private jab. "It's the traditional drink for our first-class passengers." Her tone was pleasant on the surface but carried a faint edge that Michael couldn't ignore. He met her gaze, searching for some sign that he was imagining the slight, but her expression remained composed, almost smug. "Thank you," he said coolly, taking the glass. He placed it on his tray table, determined not to give her any satisfaction. Katie lingered longer than necessary, her presence heavy with unspoken judgment. "You know," she began, her voice dropping slightly, "champagne has quite the history. It's been the symbol of luxury for centuries, reserved for royalty, aristocrats, and of course, those who belong here." She punctuated the last phrase with a glance that felt like a slap. Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He recognized the coded message in her words: "You don't belong here." "That's good to know," he replied, his tone steady despite the heat rising in his chest. He lifted the glass and took a slow sip, locking eyes with her as he did. If she expected him to falter, she'd be disappointed. Katie's lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Enjoy," she said, finally straightening and moving on to the next row. Michael exhaled quietly, gripping the stem of the glass tighter than necessary. He wasn't naive, he'd faced this kind of behavior before. But something about Katie's demeanor, the deliberate nature of her comments, the way she seemed to relish each subtle insult, made it sting more than usual. The flight progressed, but the tension only grew. Katie's interactions with Michael became increasingly pointed, her efforts to undermine him as subtle as they were deliberate. When dinner service began, she once again made her disdain known. Katie stopped at his row, holding a tray of meals. "We have beef or chicken tonight," she announced to the entire cabin, her voice loud enough to draw attention. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, she added, "But let me guess." She tilted her head, her smile condescending. "You'd prefer something more familiar?" A ripple of quiet chuckles drifted from nearby passengers. Michael felt his face flush with a mix of anger and humiliation. He straightened in his seat, refusing to look away from her. "I'll have the chicken," he said firmly, keeping his voice steady. Katie smirked as she placed the tray in front of him, her movements deliberately slow. "Of course," she said sweetly. "Chicken is a safe choice." Michael's hands itched to grab the tray and shove it aside, but he kept himself in check. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his temper. Throughout the flight, Katie continued her campaign of subtle humiliation. When Michael tried to flag her down for a refill, she ignored him, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation with another passenger. When he pressed the call button, she approached with an exaggerated sigh. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Michael asked for water, and she returned several minutes later with a half-filled glass, slamming it onto his tray table with unnecessary force. "Anything else?" she asked, her words sharp. "No," Michael replied evenly, his patience wearing thin. Katie nodded curtly and turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath that Michael couldn't quite catch but understood well enough. The older white couple across the aisle exchanged nervous glances. The woman leaned over, her voice low. "Are you okay?" she asked, her concern genuine but tentative. Michael nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, thanks." But he wasn't fine. The steady drip of Katie's insults was wearing him down, each one chipping away at the resolve he'd built over years of enduring similar treatment. As the flight neared its conclusion, Katie delivered one final blow. She stopped at Michael's row, her expression neutral but her tone cutting. "Just a reminder," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, "our first-class passengers are expected to dress appropriately in the future. We have a standard to maintain." Michael froze, his mind racing. He was dressed in a tailored suit, far more formal than many of the other passengers. He glanced around, noting the man in khakis and a polo shirt a few rows down, the woman in leggings and a sweatshirt sipping champagne without reproach. Katie's gaze was locked on him, daring him to respond. The humiliation was sharp and public, leaving Michael with little room to defend himself without appearing combative. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally, his voice steady but cold. Katie smiled, satisfied, and walked away. Michael leaned back in his seat, gripping the armrests tightly. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, their gazes filled with pity, discomfort, or quiet judgment. When the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, Michael stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He met Katie's gaze one last time as he exited the cabin, her smug smile a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Michael stepped into the terminal, the weight of the flight still pressing on his chest. But as he walked away from the gate, his shoulders straightened. He wasn't sure how he'd address what had happened, whether he'd file a complaint, speak out publicly, or confront the airline directly, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let Katie Rose have the final word. Michael leaned back in his seat, willing himself to focus on the hum of the engines and the faint chatter of other passengers. He wanted to relax, to let the weight of Katie Rose's comments roll off his back, but it was impossible. Every interaction with her seemed designed to chip away at his composure, each comment more pointed than the last. Katie returned to the cabin, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached with a tray. "Would you like a dessert?" she asked Michael, her tone sweet but her eyes cold. "Sure," he said, keeping his voice measured. She handed him a small dish with an exaggerated flourish. "Here you go. It's crème brûlée. Very sophisticated, isn't it?" Her smile widened. "Not everyone's first choice, but you seem like someone who could expand their tastes." Michael's jaw tightened. Her words were innocuous on the surface, but the patronizing tone cut deep. He glanced at the other passengers, noting how she spoke to them with an effortless warmth that was entirely absent when she addressed him. "Thanks," he said simply, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to be fishing for. Katie lingered for a moment, her smile fixed. "You know," she said, lowering her voice slightly as if sharing a secret, "it's always interesting to see the kind of people we get in first class these days. Such a variety. It really shows how things have changed." Michael set his spoon down deliberately, meeting her gaze. "What exactly do you mean by that?" She blinked, her expression feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing at all," she said quickly. "Just that it's refreshing to see new faces." Her eyes flicked to his suit, then back to his face, the implication hanging in the air: "You don't belong here." Michael inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to undercut him with backhanded compliments, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But something about Katie's relentless needling felt particularly venomous. As she walked away, Michael turned his attention to the crème brûlée, but the dessert tasted like ash in his mouth. The next interaction was worse. Katie was making her rounds, collecting trays and trash from passengers. When she reached Michael's row, she paused, her eyes scanning him in a way that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Traveling for work?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. Michael nodded. "Yes, I am." She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, that's wonderful. What kind of work do you do? I mean, it must be something unconventional." The way she emphasized the word made it clear she wasn't expecting him to say he was a CEO or an executive. Michael bristled. He was the CFO of a successful tech firm, a fact he was proud of but rarely flaunted. He didn't owe her an explanation, But he also didn't want her walking away with her assumptions intact. "I'm in finance," he said evenly. Katie's eyebrows shot up. "Finance? Oh, how interesting." She gave a small laugh, her tone teetering on the edge of disbelief. "Well, good for you. I bet you've worked very hard to get where you are." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. The implication was clear. Someone like you couldn't have gotten here without extraordinary effort, or luck. He wanted to snap back, to wipe that smug smile off her face, but he held his tongue. He wouldn't let her provoke him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice icy, "but I'd like to finish my work." Katie's smile faltered, her cheeks flushing slightly. She collected his tray without another word and moved on, but the tension lingered like a heavy cloud. Later in the flight, Katie delivered the coup de grace. As Michael worked on his laptop, she approached with the passenger manifest in hand. "Just checking in," she said, her tone overly bright. "We like to make sure all our first-class passengers are comfortable. Can I confirm your name, sir?" Michael looked up, confused. "You don't know my name? You've been serving me this entire flight?" Katie gave a light laugh that sounded forced. "Oh, of course I do. I just need to double-check for our records." "Smith, is it?" "Yes," Michael said sharply. Katie nodded, making a show of marking something on her sheet. "Thank you. We like to keep everything in order, you know. Some passengers slip in here by mistake. Not that I'm saying you did, of course." Michael felt his chest tighten. Her words were like a slap, each one calculated to humiliate him in front of the other passengers. The man across the aisle glanced over, his face a mix of pity and discomfort, but said nothing. Michael shut his laptop with a sharp click. "Is there something you need, Miss Rose?" Katie blinked, her composure slipping for the briefest moment. "No, not at all. Just doing my job." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good," Michael said, his voice low. "Then I suggest you do it without singling me out." Katie's eyes flickered with something like annoyance before she turned and walked away. Michael leaned back in his seat, his heart pounding. He rarely allowed himself to feel anger this openly, but Katie's behavior had pushed him to his limit. As the flight neared its end, Michael couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. Katie's comments, her thinly veiled disdain, were a reminder of the prejudice he'd faced his entire life. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much he achieved, there would always be people like her, people who saw his skin color first and everything else second. When the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Michael gathered his things slowly, letting the aisle clear. Katie stood at the front of the cabin, her smile as plastic as ever. As Michael passed her, he paused, meeting her gaze one last time. "Thank you for the memorable service," he said, his voice dripping with irony. Katie's smile wavered, her confidence cracking for the briefest moment. Michael walked past her without another word, stepping into the terminal with his head held high. But the sting of her words lingered, a reminder that even in first class, he couldn't escape the weight of prejudice. Michael clenched his jaw, staring out the small airplane window as the lights of the city below disappeared into the clouds. His initial resolve to stay composed had frayed under the constant barrage of Katie Rose's insults. The way she spoke to him, the comments about his presence in first class, the sneering undertone, it was too much. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, Michael stood abruptly. He couldn't endure the humiliation any longer. Grabbing his laptop bag, he pressed the call button. A different flight attendant, a young man with a nervous smile, appeared. "How can I help you, sir?" the attendant asked. Michael lowered his voice, unwilling to create a scene. "I'd like to move to a different seat. Preferably in a different cabin." The attendant blinked in confusion. Let me check availability for you." Before the attendant could leave, Katie appeared, her polished smile in place but her eyes narrowing as they landed on Michael. "Is there a problem, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her tone dripping with insincere concern. Michael's patience snapped. "The problem," he said coldly, "is that I'd like to finish this flight in peace, without being subjected to your comments." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Katie's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable. That was never my intention." Michael met her gaze steadily. I'm sure it wasn't, he said flatly. The young flight attendant returned and cleared his throat nervously. There's an open seat in business class if you'd like, sir. I'd like that, Michael said without hesitation. Katie stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line as Michael gathered his things. As he walked through the cabin, he could feel the eyes of other passengers on him. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed awkward, avoiding his gaze. The humiliation burned in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his head high. Business class was quieter, with a different set of flight attendants and fewer passengers. Michael sank into his new seat, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The absence of Katie's oppressive presence was a relief, but it couldn't erase what had already transpired. As Michael pulled out his laptop again, a voice interrupted him. "Excuse me. Do you mind if I sit here for a moment?" He looked up to see a white woman in her early 40s, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her expression was a mix of concern and determination. "I'm Emily Johnson," she said, holding out her hand. "I'm an attorney." I couldn't help but notice what happened back there. Michael hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. "Michael Smith," he replied. Emily sat in the seat next to him, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "I know you probably don't want to talk about it right now, but I couldn't sit back and let that go unaddressed. What she did to you was unacceptable." Michael exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I appreciate that," he said. "But honestly, I just want to get through this flight." Emily nodded. "I understand. But if you change your mind, I'd be happy to help. Behavior like hers needs to be reported. People like that shouldn't have the power to make others feel the way she made you feel." Her words struck a chord. Michael had spent years brushing off similar incidents, telling himself it wasn't worth the effort to fight back. But something about this experience felt different. Katie's calculated insults, the way she had so openly undermined him, left a deeper wound than he cared to admit. "You're right," he said finally. "It shouldn't be ignored. But what can I even do? It's not like she said anything blatantly racist. Was all this subtle?" Emily smiled faintly. "Subtle doesn't mean harmless. And it certainly doesn't mean it's not actionable. I'm sure there are other witnesses who noticed her behavior." "I certainly did." Michael nodded slowly, considering her words. "I'll think about it," he said. "Good," Emily replied, handing him a business card. "Take your time. But don't let this go. You deserve better." She stood and returned to her seat, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. As the plane descended, Michael stared out the window, watching the city lights grow closer. He felt a flicker of resolve stirring within him. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but Emily's words echoed in his mind. "You deserve better." When the plane landed and the passengers began disembarking, Michael waited until the aisle was clear before standing. As he passed through first class, Katie was still there, her posture rigid as she thanked passengers with her well-practiced smile. "Have a great evening," she said to Michael, her tone as forced as ever. Michael stopped, meeting her gaze one last time. "You too," he said, his voice steady. "I'm sure we'll be in touch." Katie's smile flickered, a shadow of uncertainty crossing her face. Michael turned and walked off the plane, Emily's card tucked securely in his pocket. For the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of control returning. The battle wasn't over, but he wasn't walking away this time. Michael didn't expect to hear from Emily so soon after their flight, but 2 days later, her name lit up his phone screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Michael. It's Emily Johnson from the flight," she began, her tone professional yet friendly. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "No, not at all," Michael replied, though he wasn't sure where the conversation was headed. "I wanted to follow up," Emily said. "After our discussion, I contacted the airline to report what happened. I gave a detailed account of Katie Rose's behavior, and I mentioned that you might be willing to provide additional information if needed." Michael's stomach clenched. He appreciated Emily's initiative, but the thought of reliving the humiliation and making himself a target of scrutiny wasn't appealing. "Did they say anything?" "They've opened an internal investigation," Emily said. "They've asked for statements from other passengers as well, including me. I wanted to let you know because it might gain some traction." If you're willing, your voice could make a significant impact. Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew Emily was right, but the weight of what she was asking felt heavy. I'll think about it, he said. Thanks for keeping me in the loop. Of course, Emily replied. And one more thing, you might want to check social media. This story is already picking up steam. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of him. Michael opened his phone and typed Katie Rose first-class discrimination into the search bar. The results were staggering. Posts detailing the incident had gone viral, many including first-hand accounts from other passengers who had witnessed Katie's behavior. One tweet in particular caught his eye. Witnessed the most blatant microaggressions on my flight today. Flight attendant Katie Rose went out of her way to humiliate a black man in first class. She treated him like he didn't belong. This needs to stop. #NotYourSeat*. The hashtag #NotYourSeat was trending, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and exclusion in spaces where they were made to feel unwelcome. Stories ranged from subtle slights to outright racism, and Michael's story had become a rallying cry. Michael scrolled through the comments, a mix of outrage and solidarity. This is why representation matters, one user wrote. Shame on the airline for allowing this to happen, said another. But not all the comments were supportive. Some were dismissive or outright hostile. Why is everything about race? Maybe he was just imagining it. If he can afford first class, why is he playing the victim? Michael's pulse quickened as he read the dismissive comments. The anger simmered beneath his skin, but he also felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the voices speaking up on his behalf. For the first time, it felt like people truly understood what he had endured. The next morning, Michael's phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from friends and colleagues, all asking if he had seen the story blowing up online. Even his boss had called to offer support, though the conversation was awkward at best. By noon, the airline released a statement. We take allegations of discrimination seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation into the incident involving one of our employees. We are committed to creating an inclusive and respectful environment for all passengers. The statement felt hollow, more like damage control than genuine accountability. Michael stared at the screen, his frustration mounting. This wasn't just about Katie Rose. It was about the systemic issues that allowed people like her to act with impunity. He decided to call Emily. I'm in, he said as soon as she answered. I'll give my statement to the airline. Emily's voice brightened. I'm glad to hear that. Your perspective is crucial. Let's make sure they can't sweep this under the rug. A few days later, Michael sat in a small, sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters. A representative sat across from him, a recorder on the table between them. Emily had helped him prepare, coaching him on how to frame his experiences clearly and effectively. Thank you for coming, Mr. Smith, the representative said. We're here to hear your account of the events that occurred on Flight 2347. Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. It started the moment I boarded. Katie Rose's tone and demeanor toward me were noticeably different from how she treated other passengers. She made a series of comments that implied I didn't belong in first class. He recounted everything: the champagne remark, the condescending tone, the overt insinuations about his occupation, and the final jab about passengers slipping in by mistake. He spoke calmly but with conviction, ensuring that every word landed with weight. The representative listened intently, nodding occasionally. We appreciate your honesty, Mr. Smith. We will include your statement in our investigation. As Michael left the building, he felt a sense of relief. He had done his part, and now it was up to the airline to act. The investigation's findings were announced 2 weeks later. Katie Rose was terminated from her position, and the airline pledged to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. The #NotYourSeat movement continued to grow, sparking discussions about racism and discrimination in professional and personal spaces. Michael watched from the sidelines, both humbled and overwhelmed by the attention. Strangers reached out to thank him for speaking up, sharing how his story inspired them to confront their own experiences of prejudice. One message stood out. It was from the young flight attendant who had helped him during the flight. "I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop her," the message read. "I saw what she was doing, but I was afraid to speak up. Your courage has inspired me to do better." Michael stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He typed a response. "It's never too late to stand up for what's right. Thank you for saying this." As the conversation about #NotYourSeat continued, Michael found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. What began as a humiliating experience had transformed into a catalyst for change. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like progress was within reach. Michael stood in front of the airline's headquarters 2 weeks after his harrowing flight. The official press release had just gone out, announcing the termination of Katie Rose's employment and the airline's promise to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training. While many online lauded the airline's swift action, Michael felt no sense of closure. He wanted more than a neatly packaged apology. He wanted real accountability, action that went beyond corporate lip service. The press conference was held in a sleek, modern room adorned with the airline's logo. A panel of executives, including the CEO, sat behind a long table. Michael was invited to attend as a guest, but he knew he wouldn't remain silent. As reporters filed in, their murmurs filled the air, each one eager to dissect the airline's response to the viral #NotYourSeat movement. When the CEO stepped up to the microphone, his tone was somber, his words carefully chosen. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 2347, he began. "The actions of one employee do not reflect the values of our company. Effective immediately, we are taking steps to ensure this never happens again." Michael crossed his arms, listening as the CEO outlined a series of initiatives: diversity and inclusion workshops, an anonymous reporting system for passengers, and partnerships with organizations advocating for racial equity in the workplace. On the surface, it all sounded promising, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was performative, a desperate attempt to salvage their public image rather than address systemic issues. When the floor opened for questions, Michael raised his hand. The room fell silent as a reporter handed him the microphone. "Michael Smith," he introduced himself, his voice steady. "I'm the passenger who experienced the discrimination you're addressing today." The CEO nodded, his expression neutral. "Mr. Smith, thank you for being here. We appreciate your courage in coming forward." Michael didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've announced new training and policies, which is a start, but what assurances can you give that this won't just be a one-time PR move? How will you ensure these initiatives lead to lasting change within your company?" The CEO hesitated for a moment, clearly taken aback by the directness of the question. "That's a fair concern," he said carefully. "We're committed to transparency and will regularly update the public on our progress. Our employees will undergo rigorous training and will hold leadership accountable for implementing these changes." Michael pressed on. "Accountability is important, but how will you address the culture that allowed Katie Rose to feel comfortable acting the way she did? This isn't just about one person, it's about a system that tolerates and perpetuates bias." A murmur rippled through the room. The CEO's polished facade slipped slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Smith," he said. "Changing the culture takes time, but we're committed to making that change. We'll be consulting with experts to identify and dismantle biases within our policies and practices." Michael nodded but didn't sit down. "One last thing," he said, his tone firm. "An apology is meaningless without action. You owe it to every passenger, every person who has felt excluded or devalued, to make this right. I'll be watching." The room erupted in applause as Michael handed back the microphone. The CEO smiled thinly, but his discomfort was palpable. In the days that followed, the airline ramped up its efforts to control the narrative. Social media was flooded with posts detailing the new initiatives, accompanied by glossy videos of employees participating in workshops led by diversity consultants. But Michael remained skeptical. He agreed to an exclusive interview with a major news outlet, determined to keep the pressure on. Sitting across from the journalist, he recounted the events of the flight in painstaking detail, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "What went through your mind when Katie Rose implied you didn't belong in first class?" the journalist asked. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't just about me, he said. Her comments were a reminder of how society still views people like me, as outsiders, as exceptions. It's exhausting to constantly prove you deserve the same respect as everyone else. The journalist nodded. Do you think the airline's response has been sufficient? Not yet, Michael said firmly. They've taken steps, but it's too soon to say if they're serious about real change. My goal isn't to punish one person, it's to challenge the systems that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. The interview aired that evening, sparking renewed discussion online. The hashtag #NotYourSeat gained traction again, with advocates calling for more accountability in the airline industry as a whole. Stories of discrimination in airports and on flights poured in, creating a groundswell of momentum. The airline invited Michael to join a newly formed advisory board focused on equity and inclusion. At first, he was reluctant. The idea of working closely with the company that had caused him so much pain felt like an insult. But after discussing it with Emily and other supporters, he realized it was an opportunity to ensure his voice, and the voices of others, would be heard. His first meeting with the board was tense but productive. He sat across from high-ranking executives and consultants, unafraid to challenge their assumptions. The problem isn't just training, Michael said, his tone measured but firm. It's how you recruit, how you promote, how you treat your employees. If your workforce doesn't reflect the diversity of your passengers, you're failing. The executives nodded, scribbling notes as Michael spoke. By the end of the meeting, he felt a flicker of hope, tentative but real. Months later, the airline released its first progress report. The changes were incremental but meaningful. Increased diversity in hiring, revamped training programs, and a commitment to measuring employee and passenger satisfaction through anonymous surveys. Michael read the report carefully, noting the areas where they still fell short. He remained vocal, using his platform to hold the airline accountable while amplifying the stories of others. The journey wasn't over, but he was proud of the progress they had made. For Michael, the fight wasn't just about reclaiming his seat, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to fight for theirs. Michael adjusted his tie nervously as he stood backstage at the Global Inclusion Summit. The sprawling conference hall buzzed with energy, packed with professionals, activists, and leaders from around the world. The spotlight felt daunting, but Michael knew this was bigger than him. His experience had ignited a conversation, but now he had the chance to push it forward, to transform a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. The MC's voice boomed through the hall, introducing him with a brief summary of the viral #NotYourSeat movement and the impact it had on corporate accountability. As Michael stepped onto the stage, applause erupted. He took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces looking up at him with anticipation. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "A few months ago, I boarded a flight like any other passenger. I expected comfort, professionalism, and respect. What I received instead was a reminder that even in spaces I've earned my way into, some people will see me as out of place." The room fell silent as Michael recounted the events of that flight, sparing no detail. He described Katie Rose's biting remarks, the microaggressions disguised as pleasantries, and the humiliation of being treated as though he didn't belong. His voice faltered briefly when he spoke about how her comments had forced him to confront the harsh reality of systemic bias, but he pushed through. "What struck me most wasn't just the blatant prejudice," he said, his voice gaining strength. "It was the silence. Passengers saw what was happening, and most said nothing. The few who did express support waited until it was over, their concern whispered in hushed tones. Silence is complicity." A ripple of nods moved through the audience. Michael paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. That experience could have ended with an apology and a corporate press release, but it didn't. It became part of something bigger. People from all walks of life shared their stories of discrimination in professional spaces. Stories of being overlooked, undermined, and excluded simply because of who they are. #NotYourSeat wasn't just about me. It was about all of us reclaiming the spaces we've earned. The story of Michael's flight had become a symbol, but the summit was an opportunity to connect it to the larger fight for equity and justice. He pivoted, sharing how his role on the airline's advisory board had opened his eyes to the systemic nature of bias in corporate culture. Diversity training is not enough, he said firmly. Real change requires examining every layer of an organization, hiring practices, promotion pipelines, workplace culture. It requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that bias isn't just about individuals like Katie Rose. It's baked into the systems we navigate every day. He shared examples of how organizations could move beyond performative actions. He spoke of transparency in promotions, mentoring programs for underrepresented groups, and the importance of empowering employees to hold their peers accountable. When companies prioritize equality, Michael said, gesturing to the audience, it's not just about being morally right, it's about being stronger. Inclusive environments foster innovation, collaboration, and growth. It's a win for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, but Michael wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice softening. But let me be clear, this isn't just about policies. It's about people. It's about the flight attendant who messaged me after that flight, admitting she stayed silent because she was afraid. It's about the countless stories I've heard since then, stories of people who've endured worse but felt too powerless to speak up. Change happens when we stop accepting silence as the default. Michael paused, scanning the crowd. He could see the emotion in their faces, determination, empathy, even tears. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Every one of you has a choice to make, he said. Will you be the person who looks away, who stays silent? Or will you be the one who stands up, who says, this is not right? Because I promise you, the ripple effect of one voice can be extraordinary. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. As Michael stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. People lined up to shake his hand, some sharing their own experiences, others simply thanking him for his courage. Among them was a young woman who introduced herself as an HR manager for a major tech company. Your story hit me hard, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We've been struggling to address bias in our workplace, and listening to you, it made me realize we've been too focused on optics. We need real change. Michael smiled, gripping her hand firmly. You're already taking the first step, he said. Acknowledging the problem is where it begins. Throughout the evening, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conversations he had, the connections he made, it was clear that people were hungry for solutions, not just slogans. The hashtag #NotYourSeat movement had become a rallying cry, but now it was transforming into tangible action. Months later, Michael found himself at another summit, this time as a panelist alongside CEOs, activists, and scholars. His voice carried more weight now, his experiences shaping discussions about accountability and inclusion in professional environments. The airline that had once humiliated him was now seen as a case study in corporate redemption, with its revamped policies setting a new standard for the industry. Michael's journey hadn't been easy. The scars of that flight still lingered, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they fueled his drive to create a world where no one would have to fight for their seat, whether on a plane, in a boardroom, or anywhere else. Standing at the podium, Michael concluded his remarks with the same conviction that had carried him through those dark moments. The fight for equality isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. And every step we take together brings us closer to a future where everyone, everywhere, belongs. The applause was deafening, but Michael's focus remained steady. This was just the beginning. The work continued.